Welcome to Hartford Next. It's our city series, the series that is to help us help understand Hartford city government, how it works, impacts our lives, and how citizens get involved. Today's episode, number 9, features the City of Hartford CFO and Director of Finance, Leigh Ann Ralls, and Director of OPM Budget Grants Revenue, Julian Freund. I'm Marion Griffin, Board Co-Chair for Hartford Next. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about Hartford Next and the NRZs. We are the coalition of Hartford's Neighborhood Revitalization Zones, or NRZs, if you're not familiar with it. And our purpose is to help the residents of the city and the NRZs to improve the quality of life in Hartford. And if you are not familiar with your Neighborhood Revitalization Zone, you're welcome to go to our website at hartfordnext.org to look up your NRZ and actually find out how you can join and become a member and partner with your other neighbors to improve your neighborhood. What I'd like to do this morning is to introduce you to our host today, which is Nyesha Dickinson. She is the chair of Upper Albany NRZ, and I'd like to welcome her as host. And she will then introduce our guest today. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. As stated before, my name is Nyesha Dickinson, and I am the chair of the Upper Albany Neighborhood Revitalization Zone. The Upper Albany NRZ areas borders Clay Arsenal, Northeast, Blue Hills, and Asylum Hills NRZs, and has a population of approximately 6,900 residents. We have churches, schools, hospitals, and great restaurants in our area. We also have a strong committee of residents who sincerely care about their community. Our NRZ meets on the first Monday of every month at 5:30, mostly on Zoom or here at the library during the warmer months. Thanks for joining us for this It's Our City series, where today we will follow the money with the City of Hartford. Our guests joining today are Leigh Ann Ralls, CFO and Director of Finance, and Julian Freund, Director of Management, Budget, Grants, and Revenue. If you are watching on YouTube, feel free to place questions in the comments, in which we will get to later. Now to start, could each of you tell me a little about yourself and your role with the City of Hartford?
Sure, I'll go first. Good morning, everyone. My name is Leigh Ann Ralls. I am the CFO and the Director of Finance for the City of Hartford. A little bit about my background is I have 25 years experience in governmental finance and accounting, 19 years of that here at the City of Hartford. I am a CPA, which is a certified public accountant. I started my career auditing towns and cities across the state of Connecticut, and then eventually transitioned into government accounting itself. So around 2017, I was appointed to the Director of Finance role by then Mayor Luke Bronin, and in 2022, I was appointed as CFO for the city.
Thank you for sharing. And Julian, can you please tell us about yourself and your role with the City of Hartford?
Sure thing. Good morning. My name is Julian Freund. I'm the Director of Management, Budget, Grants, and Revenues. And I have been with the city for just about 2 years. I started in January of 2023. But my ties to the city go back to when I started my career. My first job out of college was with a small nonprofit called Loaves and Fishes here in the city. At the time was based out of a church on Signey Street. And shortly after that, I got my master's in public administration. And ever since then, I've been working in local government. I worked for the town of Windsor, the town of Manchester, the Kansas City Housing Authority. I took one little detour for a few years to go work with another Hartford nonprofit. And then I took a job with the Office of Policy and Management at the state, again, working directly with municipalities that were designated for oversight due to fiscal distress, and that sort of reestablished my ties with the City of Hartford. I came from that position. I took the position here in the city, and I'm super glad that I did.
Okay.
I feel like I'm in a really great place.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing. And Could each of you, and we'll start with you, Leigh Ann, how do each of your department help maintain the financial stability of the city?
Sure. So I directly manage the finance department. And just to give a little background on the finance department, there are 5 divisions within the finance department. Administration, which really entails myself, my executive assistant, and the risk management team. And the risk management team manages the city's insurance, but also workers' compensation, and addresses safety programming for our staff. So for folks in Department of Public Works or the fire department, they're organizing safety training that pertains to their area. I also manage the tax assessment division, which is the division that assesses all of the real property in the city to determine its taxable value. Manage the tax collection office, who then collects all of the taxes that the assessor's office values. I also manage the procurement division. So we are responsible in procurement for procuring all of the goods and services throughout the city in a fair and equitable manner, but also ensuring that the city's getting the most cost savings as possible. And then I finally manage the accounting and control division, which encompasses our accounting team, our accounts payable team, and our payroll team. So all together, all of us work collaboratively to ensure that the city's finances are operating within its fiscal policies. We do manage a decentralized program, so we are working closely with the departments to ensure that they're following city policies and state and federal mandates. We want to make sure that we are following best practices overall for government accounting itself, and then we provide crucial information to the mayor, to Julian's team, to the COO of the city, to ensure that they have all the information possible to make the best decisions for the city.
Okay, and Julian, the same question is for you. How does your department help to maintain the financial stability of the city?
Yes, so my department is comprised of 4 divisions. So we have our budget division, which is responsible for basically the full budget cycle. So we work on developing the budget, implementing the budget, monitoring the budget with the departments, ensuring that all of our revenues and expenditures are on track and stay on track. That office also does long-range forecasting, so we do a 5-year forecast of revenues and expenditures. So we're always looking outward. We're developing the budget and the plan for how we're going to use our resources over the next 12 months, and then we do these longer-term forecasts that give us some guidance for the next 5-year period. And then we also have the grants division, which it has two major functions. One is to manage 3 HUD grants that the city receives and then distributes out to community agencies and some internal departments. That would include the CDBG program. So the grants office manages that whole process from the point of soliciting proposals from community agencies, evaluating those proposals, putting together a plan, getting the council approval on that plan, and then implementing the plan, ensuring compliance and all of those things, and distributing those funds to the subrecipients. They also support all of the other departments in their grant acquisition efforts. So it could be, depending on the department or the grant involved, it could be helping to write the grants. It could be simply helping them find grants. It could be providing assistance in managing or doing the compliance reporting and things of that nature. We have a revenue division, which is responsible for collecting all of the non-tax revenues that the city receives. And then we also have a central duplication and mail division, which is, provides internal copy services and internal mail services to the city departments. And so we're always looking at the resources that are coming in, monitoring how they're going out, and helping the mayor and leadership determine how to allocate those resources and stay on top of it.
Okay, thank you.
I would also add to that we have about 50 employees in the finance department and about 15 in OMBG, which is what we call Julian's department for short. And then as CFO, my role is oversight of both departments.
Okay, thank you. And Leigh Ann, what are some of the highest financial priorities for the city this year?
So as far as financial priorities, it's kind of twofold. So this question is one that could be addressed by both Julian and I. So I'll start with the finance side.
Okay.
For me, my first priority is always to make sure that everything is reported accurately, right? Ensuring that there's minimal risk of fraud. And that's one of my biggest goals, is to prevent fraud in the city. So I have to develop programs that the departments use daily to monitor compliance. So for me, it would be, first off, minimizing fraud throughout the city through use of internal controls. And internal controls is a word I'm going to say a lot this morning. So to give you all a definition of what that means is, there are different processes that we use to ensure that the accounting throughout the city is ensuring accurate financial reporting, it's minimizing fraud, and it's ensuring compliance with all of our internal policies, our governmental accounting policies, and then our federal and state mandates. So an example of an internal control would be cash, right? So cash is the city's most vulnerable asset, not just the city's, but any organization. So you want to make sure that cash doesn't just walk away every day, right? Especially in the city when we take in $300 million of tax revenues, right, in the finance department. So an internal control would be that the person who is accepting the cash is not the person who is reconciling the cash at the end of the day. And then that person is not the one who's depositing it to the bank, and it's not the person who is reconciling our records to the bank records at the end of every month. So we do day-to-day internal controls over all of our processes to make sure that we are reporting fair and accurate numbers.
Okay. And Julian, this question is to you as well. What are the highest financial priorities for the city of Hartford this year?
Right, and from a budgeting perspective, it's really to keep the city on its path towards fiscal stability. City's made tremendous progress over the last 4 to 5 years in stabilizing its finances, and we have long-term plans that have been approved and reviewed by the state's oversight agency, which we can talk about later. And so it's really just to stay on course and continue to build our reserves to the city's target level, which is 7.5% of our annual expenditures is our target to have in reserves at any given time. And over the last several years, the city's made continual progress towards that goal. And so that's one of the high-level priorities, is to keep marching in that direction.
Okay. And Julian, how does the city determine budget allocations for different departments?
So our process is that the budget process kicks off with our office calculating what the staffing requirements will be for each department, and we establish what the baseline budget would be for a department to continue at its current level of services. And then each department, in addition to that, will propose what we call business cases, which are their ideas for either enhancing services, or maybe it's achieving an additional efficiency or expanding a program or things of that nature. Those are then evaluated by the mayor as he puts together his budget proposal. And to the extent that we have the capacity to accommodate any of those business cases, the mayor will decide which ones to include in a recommended budget.
Okay, and this question is also for you. What measures are in place to ensure financial stability and avoid budget deficits? So
there's some fairly simple and widely accepted best practices in budgeting that are, probably will remove a lot of the mystique around budgeting. But they're pretty straightforward. And one is to budget conservatively. So you want to make realistic assumptions about your revenue projections and not get out ahead of yourself, and have realistic projections about your expenditures and make sure that you're being conservative in all of those assumptions. So that's one thing. And then another, really basic principle is that you don't want to use non-recurring revenues to support recurring expenditures. So for example, if you had a one-time windfall of revenue from a sale of a property or a one-time increase in a grant program that you know is not going to be sustained, you would not increase your expenditures, your recurring expenditures, to match that revenue because you know that revenue is not sustainable. So those are just basic practices that if a municipality follows, it's going to avoid the vast majority of fiscal problems that it can get into. You want to make sure you're fully funding your required pension contributions, your debt service payments, and all of those things as well. But it's really just a certain amount of discipline in planning and budgeting.
Okay, and Julian, how does the city balance investments in public services with fiscal responsibility?
Again, it's really following those sort of simple principles. We, each fiscal cycle are going to evaluate and determine what our revenue capacity or what our capacity is based on our projected revenues and what kinds of investments we can accommodate. And there's always more ideas and more opportunities to make investments and enhance services than we have the resources to support. So it's a matter of just prioritizing once we know what we can accommodate.
Okay, and Julian, what impact do state and federal funding sources have on Hartford's budget?
Quite significant impact. Our operating budget is supported, just under half, about 47% of our operating budget is supported by state aid, directly from the state. In addition to that, we have, roughly, depending on the year and sort of how many grants are active at that particular point in time, we have upwards of $200 million of grant activity going on over the course of a year. And those support, programs and projects outside of just our regular operating budget. So they could be capital grants that help support, road projects or building projects. They could be programs. We do rely on grants to support a lot of public health programs. We talked about the HUD programs earlier, like CDBG. HUD supports, it's HUD funds that support the Section 8 program in the city. So there's a wide range of federally and state funded activities above and beyond just our operating budget.
Okay, and Julian, what are the city's primary sources of revenue and how have they changed in recent years?
So we just talked about grants. So if we're talking about the operating budget, grants and in the form of state aids accounts for about 47% of our revenues. 48% is supported by property taxes. So right there, you've got 95% of your budget. All of the other revenue sources combined account for about 5% of our budget. And those ratios, they move a little bit from year to year, but that's essentially what our revenue picture is comprised of, is state aid, property taxes, and then everything else making up about 5%. And the 5% is still significant, right? We get permit fees, the interest on our investments. The town clerk's or city clerk's office generates a certain amount of fees, but it's a relative to those other two sources, a small part of the picture.
Okay, thank you. And Leigh Ann, what steps is the city taking to increase revenue without overburdening the taxpayers?
So, as you heard Julian mention, around 48% of the budget is tax revenues, and the other 47 is state aid. So we've only got about a 5% window to work with as far as materiality towards really helping ease off on taxes. But basically, because only half of the city is taxable, we try to rarely increase the mill rate, which would increase overall taxes on our residents. We try not to ever do that. As a matter of fact, recently, in the last few years, we were able to decrease the mill rate to try and take some burden off of the taxpayers. But we also collaborate with the state a lot. Half of the city is non-taxable, and a lot of that is due to the state owning a fair share of that property. So we work with the state a lot to try and get grant funding for projects where residents of the state of Connecticut are flowing to the capital city, but they don't reside there. So it's hard for us as the capital city to finance projects where it's not really just our residents who are maybe wearing down the streets or are in the parks for events. So we work with the state a lot, and we get a lot of aid from the state. It's a great relationship that the mayor's office has with the state team, and we work well together there. We work a lot with our not-for-profit partners to try and collaborate on different programs, sharing costs, and then we also look for new revenue streams. It's difficult to find new revenue in government because it's usually in the form of a fine or penalty. But like most recently, we are looking into a state statute that was passed on drivers illegally passing school buses. So how can we utilize that state statute to try and make our streets safer for our residents, even though it might be a burden on some of the residents if they're the ones performing that illegal act, but it will also encompass anybody who is driving in our capital city. So we try and take advantage of those things when they pop up as well.
Okay. And
oh, I would like to add too.
Okay.
So Julian mentioned conservative budgeting, and that's a key part in making sure that we're not overburdening our taxpayers, because he's budgeting numbers that are achievable to reach annually, and he's not overstretching the city to try and get to these revenue goals to cover expenditures. So as long as we have our budget built on achievable revenues, then Julian can then say, okay, this is our revenue base, and now we can incur expenditures up to that amount.
Thank you. And Julian, what are the biggest cost drivers in Hartford's budget?
So in terms of the largest components of the budget, you know, we're primarily a service organization, so it's really our people. So payroll and the benefits that support our employees, you know, between the health insurance and retirement contributions, that really makes up the bulk of it. We also, you know, utilities are a considerable expense, and not so much as it used to be, but we still do carry some debt service on some capital projects that are still being paid down. But we're, you know, as a service organization, it really revolves around our people.
Okay. All right. And Leigh Ann, is funding for education handled separately?
So Hartford Public Schools has their own administration unit. They have their own finance department, their own CFO. So basically what happens is in the general fund's annual budget process, Julian will allocate a certain share of the city's revenues towards Hartford Public Schools so that we can support their operations. And then we also receive a relatively large grant from the state of Connecticut called the Educational Cost Sharing Grant that we also send over to Hartford Public Schools. So they use those funds to operate the main school expenses, and then on top of that, they get grants, both federal and state as well. So we kind of operate in two different silos throughout the year, and then every year we have to go through an annual audit. That is done by an external auditor, kind of what I used to do at the start of my career. And that audit then requires us, and our governmental accounting mandates require us to then combine the activity of the Hartford Public Schools in the city because we're reporting as one unit. So operationally, we're, you know, two cars on the same street, parallel on the highway, but at the end of the year reporting, then we're just one.
Okay, thank you. And what are the biggest financial challenges Hartford faces in managing its funds, Leigh Ann?
Sure. So I want to just clarify the word funds.
Okay.
Okay. So when I say funds, or when people say funds, they refer to cash, right? Cash investments, tools that we can use to incur expenditures. But the way that the city charter is set up, the Department of Treasury and the city's treasurer, Madam Carmen Sierra, currently they manage all cash and investments for the city.
Okay.
So the charter naturally creates a segregation of duties between the finance department and the treasurer. So our general fund, which is our operational fund for the city, right? That's our day-to-day operations. We in finance, we actually have 90 funds throughout the city. So we refer to funds as kind of a organization.
Okay.
So it organizes all of the city's finances into these little buckets. So we have the general fund, which is main operations for the city, but then we have another fund called capital projects. And that's where we manage all of our capital projects for the city. And then we have, as Julian mentioned earlier, the debt service fund. And debt service is basically kind of like the mortgage, right? So if you build a new school, you have to take a mortgage out to either renovate that school or fund the construction of the schools. So it's like a long-term loan, usually 25 to 30 years long, where the city would take out this loan and we would incur large capital projects. So that's where all the debt service fund activity is. Then we have special revenue funds, we have agency funds, we have so many different types of funds, but that's what my team manages. So in terms of funds, cash and investments, that's the treasurer. Operational funds to manage city's finances, that's on my team. We have right now 89 different funds throughout the city. Okay. And my biggest challenge in managing those funds is really just resources, right? So it's staffing resources, making sure that my accounting team is large enough to manage the accounting of each of those different funds on a day-to-day basis, making sure that they have the skill set necessary and the training necessary to handle that governmental accounting for each specific fund, because of course it's government, everything is kind of more complex than normal. So each fund has different accounting rules associated with it. So I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty with it, but overall it's just, you can't treat everything the same. I can't treat the purchase of a fire truck the way that I would treat the purchase of a computer. Things are just, they just operate differently. So ensuring that the staff has the skills and the training necessary, and we have enough staff to manage the accounting citywide.
Okay, so just to add to that, I'm sure there's measures in place to minimize the risk of managing the funds.
There is. So it goes back to what I mentioned earlier, internal controls, the big IC word. So there's multiple different types of internal controls, and several that we use are our IT system, right? So our IT system is structured so it delineates out each department of the city. And then I may have a staff in the Department of Public Works who only has access to see the financial activity of Public Works. So being in the finance department, we can oversee everybody, but if you're in an individual department themselves, then you're only working within your department. So it restricts employees from hitting someone else's budget, right, and utilizing their funds versus their department's funds. So that's one of the controls we use. We use policies and procedures, you know, the city's policy for travel, making sure that each department is following the travel policy, the procurement card policy, the cash policies. So we use those policies to control how cash and financial activity move throughout the departments. Segregation of duties, again, someone who is paying city employees in the payroll department, they are not allowed to add any new employees to the system, right? Because somebody could put a fictitious employee in the system and then run the payroll and pay that fictitious employee who may be, let's say, the payroll manager. But again, the city's charter built in a lot of natural segregation and duties in that the finance department is just responsible for paying employees. The HR department, human resources, they're the ones that are going to add any new employees into our software. They're the ones that are going to set the pay rate for the employee. So because we can delineate between who is doing what for payroll, it doesn't allow for contamination of that process. So those are just some examples on how we control.
All right. And Julian, what steps are being taken to modernize financial operations? And you can add to that, Leigh Ann, once he answers. Thank you.
Right. Well, from my department's perspective, there are really two things that we're working on at the moment, and both revolve around software. So up until now, our grants operation really did not have a system in place that could comprehensively manage our grants and have a comprehensive database of all the grants that are in place. We were really relying on a financial system as kind of our database, and it wasn't built to be a grants management system. So we've acquired some software that we're in the implementation process of now to support our grants processes with this software through the whole grant cycle. So in developing applications, submitting applications, managing awards, managing reporting, and managing compliance. Then next, we're going to do something on the budget side. Currently, we use, obviously, our budget is built in our financial system, but in terms of creating our budget document and doing our monthly reporting, we have some Excel-based models that we use for forecasting and for doing a lot of that reporting and internal analysis. And it's time to upgrade to some software. So we are in the process of looking at options to acquire some software for a lot of our budget reporting processes. But those are the two things we're working on at the moment.
Okay. And anything you want to add to that in regards to modernizing financial operations?
Sure. So we are always reviewing best practices for internal controls, making sure they're as strong as possible. But we've recently made some big changes on the assessment side. So we've been shifting towards, especially since the pandemic, but we had started the shift prior to the pandemic, was moving towards more online access for our residents and our local businesses. So I would say over the last 2 years, we've implemented a software called Just Appraised, and it's actually an AI-based software that reads all of the sales documents whenever there is a sale of a property in the city. And then it actually creates the field record in the assessor software that allows them to say, oh, this is a 100 square foot building, it's located at this address, it's on this piece of this many acres of land. And it creates that field record, which prevents us having to create it manually, which is what we used to do historically. We'd have assessment techs from our assessment team in the town clerk's office going through deeds, trying to catch up on the sales. So that has been a significant save on the assessment side. A second practice that we just did, this is our second year with it, is we went to online filing for personal property declarations for our small business. Again, they don't have to fill out those property tax forms, which if you think back to the IRS, right, you get the form in the mail and it's, 3 or 4 pages, and you can only write in black pen and in block letters to fill out the form. So now it's an electronic-based filing. And in the first year, I want to say we had maybe 600 small businesses that utilized the online filing portal, and it's increased again for year 2. So it's becoming more and more popular, and obviously something that our community is looking for.
Okay. And Julian, what efforts are being made to engage residents in the budgeting process?
So our budgeting process really kicks off from the public's perspective with the release of the mayor's recommended budget. That is scheduled this year to take place on March 24th. The budget will be released in parallel with the mayor's State of the City address. And that really kicks off the public process. We start with a public hearing to present the budget. That's scheduled currently to take place on April 2nd. And so there are public hearings that bookend kind of a lengthy process. There's that first one on April 2nd, which is kind of to introduce the budget to the public, for the mayor to outline his major initiatives, what he's hoping to accomplish with next year's budget. It's a public hearing. Obviously, that's open to the public. The public has the opportunity to speak at those meetings. That's followed by a series of public, they're like budget workshops, but they're open to the public. The city council meets with each department over the course of a month, so through April, and it does spill over a little bit into May. The council meets with each department to review their recommended budget. They ask questions, they dig in, take a deep dive on each department. Those workshops are scheduled to take place from April 9th through May 5th. And then I said that there are big public hearings that bookend the process. And there's the final public hearing, which is on Wednesday, May 7th. And that will be another opportunity for folks to speak at a public hearing with their feedback on the budget as proposed. All of those workshops, by the way, are televised on Hartford's Public Access and are also recorded. And so they're accessible after the fact as well in the public meetings. So that kind of lays out the public process for the budget process. And then we do also, just touching briefly on the CDBG side of things, we're working on the CDBG program for the next program year, which starts in July. And there will be, I don't have the dates yet, but there will be public hearings associated with that. And we're also working on the 5-year plan related to the HUD programs. And that will have a public input component as well. It's basically a public comment period where we'll be able to take input from the general public, and then that gets woven into the process for finalizing the plan. Okay. So those dates are to be determined, but all of this and basically everything we do through the budget process is accessible on our website as well. So you can see documents as they're prepared and developed. They get posted on our website.
Okay, thank you. And Leigh Ann, what is the city's approach to funding infrastructure improvement and public work projects?
Sure. So we utilize a pay-as-you-go process for funding what we call CIP, or capital improvement projects. And basically, when Julian is developing the annual budget, he allocates a certain amount that can be used towards funding those projects. And then his team also works with the departments to get grants to help offset any infrastructure costs.
Okay. Is there anything you want to add to that, Julian?
No, I think the grants piece is important. We do receive considerable support through DEP, Department of Transportation, Department of Economic and Community Development, to really make a lot of our projects feasible that would otherwise be, a significant burden to be able to pull off with just local resources.
Okay. And Leigh Ann, how does the city manage its debt, and what steps are being taken to reduce the long-term liabilities?
So, this one can get a little dicey. So, back in 2018, the city and the state came to an agreement that the state would take over the city's long-term debt, what we call general obligation bonds.
Okay.
So those are bonds that you take out for just general maintenance of the city's infrastructure. That happened in 2018, so they took on debt that has to be paid out through 2036. Since the state took on that debt, and again, it dates back to having to maintain infrastructure that not only our residents use, but being the capital city, any resident of Connecticut can use. But since that contract, it had freed up a large part of the city's budget for Julian to then allocate towards other needs of the city. So in order to control that going forward, part of that agreement requires, or actually, what's the word I want? Restricts, that's the word. I knew it was an R word. That restricts our ability to go out into the market and incur more general obligation debt.
Okay. And what measures are in place to ensure responsible borrowing and financial stability, Leigh Ann?
So that contract assistance agreement
Okay.
restricts our ability to go to
Okay.
the market. But not only that, it also requires us to go to the state OPM, Office of Policy and Management, Secretary, and the state treasurer. Both would need to agree that the city could issue debt and that the need for that debt issuance is there.
Okay. And this is a question that anyone can answer. What strategies are in place to ensure Hartford remains financially stable in the future?
So
It all starts with Julian.
Yeah. Just starting with one component of that, which is actually kind of flows out of what we were just talking about on the debt side of things, and all the restrictions that are in place now, someday the city will need to begin to use borrowing as one of its tools for financing large capital projects. And so, in terms of remaining financially stable and financially responsible, one of the things that a city would do, and one of the best practices, would be to build guardrails around that manage and provide some limitations and policies on what kinds of things you can borrow for, the duration of the maturity of the bonds that are issued, restricting your overall total debt so that there's a cap on it, restricting how much of your annual budget can go towards debt service. So building those guardrails around debt when the time comes for the city to dip its toe back into the debt market, that's a big piece of remaining financially stable. And I think just as, kind of general practice, it's those practices we talked about earlier about, using responsible assumptions about what your revenues are going to be, factoring in all of your expenditures, coming up with accurate projections of those. That's really the core of maintaining fiscal stability.
Mhm.
Okay.
And I would also add to that, maintaining strong internal controls to minimize risk and fraud within our financial processes, ensuring that our policies and procedures are best practices. And then I just want to circle back a minute on
Okay.
debt service, because we're throwing all these terms out there and sometimes it's hard to remember that not everybody knows what debt service is.
Okay.
But So debt service really is long-term borrowing, right? So it would be equivalent to you purchasing a home. You don't want to pay 25, 30 years for an asset that you can only utilize for maybe 5 years,
Okay.
right? So you don't want to issue long-term debt for 500 computers, because those computers, they have a life expectancy 3 to 5 years tops. So why would we pay out 25, 30 years for something that we can only use for 5 years? So it's looking at all of the projects and the life expectancy of that project, and then determining the need for long-term debt issuance, a general obligation bond, AKA mortgage, to finance it. So what we do with Julian is we also look at the capital improvement plan at the same time as we're creating the general fund budget, because the capital improvement plan includes all the city's infrastructures, the streets, the bridges, the street lights, the buildings, the school system, and then making a determination of repairs that are needed. What's a priority for our residents' safety, right? And then we have to prioritize those projects and then use the allocation that Julian deems out of the budget to see what we can actually accomplish in a year. And if we can't get to all of those projects, which ones have to be done now to ensure that our residents are safe? You know, we don't want cars driving over a big crater in the middle of Farmington Avenue or Albany Avenue, right? And then we're incurring all this crazy debt because of legal fees for people suing for new trannies on their car or tires. So you have to look at everything kind of big picture at one time.
Okay. And so what are the biggest financial risks facing the city, and how is your office preparing for them? It could be answered by any of you.
I'm going to kick this one to Julian because it's all related to federal grants.
Okay.
Right, the federal grant picture is in flux, and we know that some federal grant streams are probably not going to continue. We don't know exactly which ones are, but there are some hints as to which ones might not continue. At this point, you know, there's numerous cases that have been filed to at least keep the currently contracted funds coming in. And so there have been a number of court orders saying that the federal government can't just shut down a grant for a grant where there's a contract or an agreement in place. Those funds seem, right now, to appear to be relatively safe in terms of that we'll continue to get those for now. Where the risk really is probably on the renewal of grants in subsequent fiscal years. Okay. And those, you know, some are going to be more at risk than others. We have some idea which ones might be more at risk, but we're doing that risk assessment right now, and you know, between now and over the subsequent months, be coming up with contingency plans and determining which ones. Some programs might have to be sunset, but that's really an ongoing process, and we're waiting to see where some of these things land. I think another financial risk is something that probably everybody is dealing with, is the potential for a resurgence in inflation, and that that just presents difficulties. You just have to navigate around those and adjust your spending accordingly.
Okay. All right. And Leigh Ann, what is the city's long-term plan for managing debt?
So again, it goes back to that contract assistance agreement, which is in place until the debt that the state took on is paid off in 2036, I believe. But even then, going forward, it restricts our ability to go out into the market and incur new debt. We are able to do so with approval of the state, but we can only do it in certain dollar increments, which are set at levels where we can absorb it in our general fund debt.
Okay.
in our general fund budget. I should say also, and we probably should have said this from the beginning, Julian, but my department works on the day-to-day finances of the city.
Okay.
And we also work backwards, because while we're doing the day-to-day, we're usually working on the last year's audit with our external auditors. Julian's department is more forward-facing, right? So he is working on the next year's budget, but he's also looking at the current budget and projecting where we're going to land by the end of the year. So he's always forward-facing, and I'm either in today or backwards.
Okay. Okay.
Make
And-
sense?
Yes.
All right. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we close today? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh,
Yes.
questions.
Okay. So my apologies. So I'm just going to put it to the audience for questions and see if we have questions online.
So I have a couple of questions. I'll start with an easy one. CDBG means,
So sorry. I made a mental note at the beginning to not use acronyms. Community Development Block Grant. It's a HUD-funded program, and it funds a wide variety of community development type programs and services. So they could be employment type programs, really any kind of program that supports low and moderate income neighborhoods.
And HUD is
The
housing
Department of Housing and Urban Development.
from the federal government,
so possibly at risk.
possibly at risk.
Yes.
I believe the funds we get from the state are referred to as pilot, payment in lieu of taxes. Is that the majority of the 47% we get from the state?
The 47% we get, the largest single grant we get from the state is the education cost sharing grant.
Okay.
Then, yes, number two would be the pilot payment, which is roughly $60 million. Then we also get something called Town Aid for Roads. We get a revenue sharing grant. There's a handful of somewhat smaller grants. There's the casino revenue sharing grant. But those two, ECS, education cost sharing, and the pilot are the two largest.
And
So-
the town aid grant and the revenue sharing from the casinos, those are grants that most towns and cities in the state of Connecticut get.
Yeah, I think when you hear 47% of your money comes from the state, it sounds like we're a poverty-stricken city, which we are in many ways, but it's not like a handout.
Correct.
So
Right.
I think one measure of the tax situation in Hartford is that I believe less than half our land is actually taxable. And we're a small city to start with, right?
Correct.
And the formula for computing the state's payment in that regard doesn't require the state to pay 100% of the value of their very valuable land in our city. Could
Correct.
you give us some idea of the other entities and land uses that don't pay taxes in our city?
Well, obviously, it would be City of Hartford buildings and
Right.
land that we own, right? There are some churches. Not all churches are tax exempt. They have to meet certain requirements. Outside of churches,
Really other tax exempt organizations, so some nonprofits,
yeah, some, like,
Hospitals?
hospitals, universities.
yeah, but we still get pilot from hospitals.
Right, they're part of pilot,
Yeah,
yes.
right.
it's part of pilot,
But
but
that's
it's
what I
a
mean.
minimal
They're
percentage,
part
yeah.
of
Right.
that roughly half of the
Yeah.
grand list that is not taxable. They're
Right,
part
and of
that
course it
pool.
includes no payments from schools, our schools,
Yeah.
no payments for parks and so forth, right?
Correct,
I mean, we have
yeah.
tons of really great parks.
Right, and the parks are city-owned.
City-owned,
So-
right, so there's a lot of city-owned property. I have one more question. If you took the Hartford Public Schools and the City of Hartford combined, the total budget, approximately how much of that total budget is Hartford Public Schools?
It's 45%, I believe is the, I thought I might have it on my little cheat sheet here. It's roughly 45% of the total budget, the total expenditure budget.
And that would be the general fund budget.
Correct, and they have their own, none of the grant information I was talking about before even touched on the school grants, but they have, considerable grants coming in through IDEA, which is a federal grant, Title I, so forth, so.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I have a question on the CDBG grants and the impact of it's on Hartford organizations and entities that actually use those to help Hartford residents. Just what that percent is and what the potential impact of not having access to those CDBG grant funds.
So we receive through there's 3 programs. There's 2 other programs in addition to CDBG where we being the city as the grant receiver, we distribute funds to subrecipients. CDBG is the largest, but between the 3, it's roughly $5 million per year, and it fluctuates from year to year depending on what Congress appropriates. So, I don't know in terms of, I didn't understand the percentage part of the question, but those funds go primarily to, nonprofit organizations throughout the city and a whole host of, youth programming, employment programming, arts programming. Then we also allocate some portion of it for projects that departments are doing. So we did some of the citywide fiber project in some of the targeted neighborhoods was using CDBG funding, and other parks projects, for example, maybe. So it really touches on a wide breadth of the types of programming. It touches virtually every neighborhood and every part of the city. I don't know if that answered your question.
That was the gist of the question.
Okay.
Recently, there's been less of a demand for commercial space in the city.
No, it's on, up to your mouth.
Oh, just a little closer. Okay. Recently, there has been a lessening demand for commercial space in the city, resulting in high vacancy rates for some of the office buildings. And that has prompted a subsequent transition to residential. So I'm just kind of curious, just viewing what's been happening, and if that continues, what kind of an effect does that have in the revenue coming into the city, type of revenue more or less, or no effect at all?
There definitely is an increase in commercial space vacancies. Obviously, during the pandemic, a lot of companies closed down their office space and sent their employees to work remotely, which created those large holes, especially in our downtown area. Both Mayor Bronin, the last administration, and our current mayor, Mayor Aralumpalum, are both, they looked towards utilizing what's the best utilization for that commercial space. So currently there is some analysis being done on converting certain commercial space to residential space. So increasing housing available throughout the city. Also, we're seeing now a push of corporations bringing their employees back into the office, right? There was this result on employee morale from folks being at home all the time, right? You lose that ability to build camaraderie with your fellow employees and really build that teamwork and that collaborative feeling amongst the team. So we're starting to see some of those companies bring some of their business back into the city. So overall, the effect on residents, you really won't see it until the city does its next revaluation. So again, when there's a revaluation done, right? It's done from our assessor's office, and they look at all the taxable property in the city, and it's sometimes the commercial space will take on a burden of more of the taxes, right? And then sometimes that shifts more to the residentials. So I don't think we'll see any effect on the residents until that revaluation is done next. And there could be a lot of change, again, with companies bringing their employees back into the office, as well as converting some of that commercial space to housing. So we're kind of in limbo with that. There will be some effect, but we just don't know how material that effect will be.
All right, and thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to confirm, I'm sure a lot of the information or resources is provided on the City of Hartford's website for, the council meetings, budgets.
Absolutely.
So, and that,
Absolutely.
that is the hartford.gov website?
hartfordct.gov. To find Julian and I's departments, you have to actually select departments, and then you'll find Department of Finance, and then Office of Management, Budget and Grants. And under Finance, I just wanted to add, there is a section for all of our reporting. So there's our annual audit. We call it the ACFR.
Okay.
Because we love our acronyms, right? And that's our annual comprehensive financial report.
Okay.
And that's the one that's audited every year.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to note that there's two extremely important documents in the city.
Okay.
Number one, the budget, and number two, the ACFR. Both of those are accessible online. We also both do some form of monthly reporting to the mayor, to the city council, or to the state. Those documents, at least the ones we do in finance, are online. We also every year have to incur what they call a single audit, and that's an audit of all of our grant revenues, separate for federal grants versus state grants. Those are also online.
Okay.
So any report that you need, you can find there for finance, or you can just give us a call and we'll get you whatever it is you're looking for.
Okay, and thank you once again. So before I hand it over to Marian, I just want to remind everyone that our NRZ meets on the first Monday of every month, and our next meeting will be on March 3rd on Zoom. And I'll hand it over to Marian. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for participating in today's Follow the Money, featuring our Director of Finance and CFO, Leigh Ann Ralls, and our Director of OPM Revenue, Budget, and Grants, Julian Freund, and especially to Nyesha, who is our host today, representing Upper Albany NRZ. I would like to ask you to think about joining us for our next series. But before I do that, I want to underscore what we heard today. The finance department and OPM, they're, I think, the best kept secrets and are so important to the city of Hartford and to our residents. I'm sorry. And to the residents, because when we asked the Department of Public Works to put up those speed signs to slow speeds down, and they say, well, we don't have it in our budget, it's time for us to come and speak up when the budget process is going on to talk about what are the needs that we as residents have. And you've heard that there are, starting April, that there are opportunities for the public to have input, and we should take full advantage of that through the budget process this year. So use your voice, come out and support the departments and speak up. So we have upcoming 3 more sessions. On March 22nd, it's called Managing the People. So we have a lot of employees with the City of Hartford. We're going to be speaking with the Director of Human Resources and Labor Relations, also the Chief Operating Officer, the Chief of Staff, as well as the Director of Community Engagement. On April 12th, we will have Teaching the Children featuring the Superintendent of Schools, Leslie Torres Rodriguez. And then on May 3rd, Oh, this is really something we'd love for all of you to join us on. It's Get Aboard, Hartford Boards and Commissions. We would like for you to come out, learn about all the commissions, and decide how you are going to step in and be a part of this. You have a voice, you have a say. There are many commissions that might, at least one that might meet your interest. So come and join us on March 3rd. So I'd like to thank our funders, the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, and LISC, which is the Local Initiative Support Corporation, for helping us to put these on, and also the Albany Branch of Hartford Public Library, the Hartford Next Program Committee and staff, and especially to Light Source Production, today's videographer. Thank you for joining us, and hope to see you at a future event.